Our last speaker in this morning's session is Dr. John Thomas, and he will speak about how we as elected officials can communicate better during these turbulent times. Prior to joining Decide Smart as a managing partner, John served for over 2 decades as the director of the Weldon Cooper Center for Public Service at the University of Virginia. Previous professional assignments have included service as the executive director of the National Association of Counties, the American Society of Public Administration, and the Florida Association of Counties. John began his public service as a teacher and administrator in the Toledo public school system. In Virginia, John's been recognized for his significant leadership role in 2 award-winning organizations, the Council on Virginia's Future and Lead Virginia, Inc. John earned his BA from the College of Worcester, his MA from the University of Toledo, and his MPA and DPA from the University of Southern California. Join me in welcoming Dr. John Thomas.
Thank you, Jeff. When Dean and I talked about the possibility of me having a conversation with you about turbulent times and communications, I thought, well, that's not my field of expertise. What I'd like to do is to have a kind of informal conversation with you about that topic, because while I'm not an academic expert on this topic, I have lived it and felt it for a long time. In fact, I have to say, Jeff and Dean, when I was preparing for this conversation, I thought it would be casual. And then I thought, nah, the governor's going to be here. You got to have a tie on because he always wears a tie. He does not always wear a tie. And so I'm taking the liberty of taking mine off. So, but I have to say that as Dean, as I was thinking about what we would do this morning, I was reminded that it was almost to the day 50 years ago that I started with the National Association of Counties. And for those of you who didn't catch the subtleties of that introduction, I was with NACO and the Florida Association and then back to NACO for over 20 years. And when I got to the University of Virginia to deal with state and local government in Virginia, I had a lot of friends in county government. And so today, this is kind of like a family reunion for me to come back and talk about county government. It's been a passion of mine for a long time. And so it was fun to come into the room yesterday afternoon and listen to Larry and his colleagues talk about public service and the politics of the world that we're living in. And so what I want to do is to throw out a couple of topics that I think are important to the question of communicating in turbulent times. And then there are some microphones around, and I'm going to get a lavalier, and we're going to talk some about what does this mean to you as a public official. In order to frame that context, I thought there might be a few elements of the conversation that would be helpful to at least provide some focus for us. And so I want to start that by saying that, and I also should say in the context of the family reunion, I don't know about your family, but I always had a couple relatives and I thought, I hope they stay home. And so if there are some people like that in the county family, I hope they stayed home this morning. So it'll give us a chance to interact in a more constructive way, perhaps. So, but what I want to say as a start is America is built on turbulence. We are in a turbulent time. We have always been on a turbulent time in America. We started based on turbulence, and we have continued to do that. And so when I think about the time that this country moved from an agrarian society to an industrial society, and we weren't there, and I'm an amateur historian, but I can guarantee you that was turbulent. When families had to leave where they were to go to the industrial centers of America, which were mostly in the Northeast, it was a massive time of turbulence, both on where they were going and where they were leaving. And I have some of you, a number of you are from Southern Virginia. If you want to experience turbulence, look at Southern Virginia 3 decades ago. I mean, 27,000 people leave Danville, Pittsylvania County because there's no work left anymore. That is turbulence. And so the first thing I want to talk about and have you put into context is turbulence is not new to us. We've been around this for a long time. But I would say to you that if you haven't thought about this recently, we are in a massive economic change in America, far more massive even than the Industrial Revolution. The switch to what we call the information economy, leaving the industrial economy, has made a huge impact on America. A whole lot of people have embraced that new economy. It works for them, and they're in it. A whole lot of people are left out of that economy, and they are trying like hell to hang on to what they thought they used to have. That is at the core of a lot of the conversation that we deal with today in county government. If that weren't enough, and we listened to the governor talk about this, if that weren't enough, put a pandemic in place in which nobody has a clue. I mean, at least in economics, we know what the groundwork is, and we can try to struggle with that. With the pandemic, who knew what a pandemic would be? And it's not an American pandemic, it's a worldwide pandemic. And so we don't have anybody in the world that we can look to say, how do we deal with this? And so that turbulence drives all of us to a different place. And so if we thought that we were kind of balancing ourselves in this shift in the economy, all of a sudden, nothing is working. And people are dying in massive numbers. Now, what do we do about that? Well, there's a lot of things we can do in America about that. But from a core standpoint for all of us, it was hugely destabilizing. That's what pandemics do. They destabilize what you thought was solid ground. So that's where we are today. So even those of us in our communities who thought we had a handle on what we needed to do suddenly discover we are off our game. We don't know who to do what with. And so here we are in a turbulent time. Now, let's talk about communication in that environment. What we are all seeking are basically three things: reason, respect, confidence, and stability. So if you think about the core pieces of that, that's where you live as a county supervisor. It is in that area of reason, respect, confidence, and stability. And I'm going to tell you why I think you are in that spot. And I need to start that in this way, in saying that we have become superb campaigners in America. We know how to campaign. We're serious about that. Larry and the Sorensen Institute have taught hundreds of people in Virginia how to campaign effectively. Now, the key, as you all know, you've experienced it, the key to campaigning is to make sure that everybody understands you're different from your opponent. Now, we all have different ways to go about that, but that is the core of getting elected. Does the public understand how different you are and why they should choose you? Now, that is a very individualized game. And you have to be really talented and skilled at it if you want to get elected and stay elected. However, what we're supposed to do when we get elected is govern. Govern is a team venture. We don't teach people how to function in teams. You involve, probably like I am, in a church. I can guarantee you, church committee meetings are not the place to learn about teamwork. You would think with a common mission that would be a core of that. These are skills that are not easily garnered from everyday life. We are skilled at finding what is different about us. When you get into the arena in which you're supposed to govern, you have to begin to find out, what do we have in common? Because that's where we're going to find out a way to find solutions to what we have in common. Now, that is a very difficult thing to do because all of us are trained to tell people what we are. You heard my introduction. It's all about credentials. You have your own assumption about what those credentials mean, but it's what I am. I would like you to know who I am. And I can tell you who I am. I'm not going to take the time to do that right now, but as we get to conversing, if you want to know, I will for sure tell you it's values-based. We are all who we are based on what core values drive us. Now, how do we find out in a public arena what our values are? That's not an easy thing to do. It's an essential thing to do if we're going to govern. So we have to get a context in mind that we're going to have to jump out of our role as a public official for a while and try to figure out where do we sit in that arena. The reason I'm saying this is because to find that commonality, we've got to get at who we are and begin to understand what's driving other people on that I've campaigned against or campaigned adjacent to, but they have very different value sets than mine, perhaps. So how do we get there? Well, part of that issue, it seems to me, is how do we go about the process of governing? And it means that we need to figure out a way to connect with people in a different way. Now, there are many ways to do that. In a few minutes, we're going to begin to talk some about that. But let me give you an example. I do a lot of work with governing boards. I was working with a group not too long ago. I'm not going to mention any names here, but I said that in order for us to connect with each other, we need to know a little bit about each other that most of us don't know. So I said, as a beginning entry point, I'm going to ask each of you, just tell your fellow board members, nobody else in the room, just the board and attorney and manager. Tell us something that we don't know. So we're going around the room. It's a small room. There are only a small group of us. And we get to one member of the board, and she says, I don't think you probably all know it, but I've been riding a Harley for 34 years. I've been to Sturgis. I've been to Daytona Bike Week a number of times. I've traveled across the country several times on my bike. Now I'm standing across the room listening to her next to two guys. One of them leans over the other and said, don't mess with her. Now, I got to tell you, they learned more about how to connect with their fellow supervisor in that one statement than we would have dealt with their entire 3 days of our retreat. And so setting up those kinds of conversations is important. Trying to figure out how the board can work together is important. That's a cultural issue. And I know it's a cultural issue and it varies from community to community, but let me give you another example of how that can look. One of the things I always did when I was at Florida and with the National Association of Counties is I wanted to get to know our incoming officers in a very personal way. And so I would go spend a half week with them in their home community. When I was in Florida, I don't know if any of you are familiar with Florida, but Polk County, Florida it's a massive jurisdiction in Central Florida. It is basically all the land area between Orlando and Tampa. It is an agricultural and phosphate community. Now, we had 67 counties in Florida, and over the years, 4 different commissioners, they're called, had been president of this statewide organization. And I used to say to many of the other commissioners, I don't understand what's going on in Polk County, that it's so different, that they always seem to get along. And it's a robust county. You would think there'd be tremendous controversy there, but they don't seem to reflect that. And so when I went down to visit my then second vice president, his name was Frank Smith. He was a local boy from Bartow, Florida. Everybody called him Bubba. And so I spent time with Bubba, and we were at the courthouse. Now, their board meeting is in a large chamber, but the board sits behind this magnificent carved oak. It's more than a dais. It's raised, and everybody's in a comfortable chair, and it's just awesome. And we were so Bubba had me sitting with him at the dais, and we were talking about county government. I said, Bubba, what is it about? What's in the water here? You know, some way when I was with the National Association of Counties, my friends in Washington and I used to say, you know, there are 2 fundamentally different states in America. They're Virginia and North Carolina. We don't know why. but somehow they figure out how to govern themselves in a very constructive way. And when I moved to Virginia, I discovered, as your governor, our governor, just pointed out, that's very, very true. It's a very different culture. Back to culture. So we're sitting at this gorgeous desk, and I'm reaching, like an old school teacher, I'm reaching under the edge of the wood to find the gum. You know, that always tells you who sat there and how long they sat you by the amount of gum that you could found stuck underneath. But what I found was little notches in the wood. And I said to Bubba, you know, this is not what I expected. What are these little notches? He said, well, let me give you an example. He said, you know, I'm telling you these names because it's been a long time ago. They're out of office. They were good friends of mine. One of them is no longer with us. And so there are going to be no retributions for me. So you can check them up. I'm telling you their names because I want you to know this is not a made up story. That's easy to do for a preacher's kid, but this is not one of those. And so, so I'm feeling these notches, and I said, Bubba, what is this all about? And he said, well, he said, you know, Brenda, she was our first environmentalist elected in Polk County 2 years ago. And we weren't quite sure how we were going to deal with an environmentalist because none of us are. And the very second board meeting, she introduced a proposed amendment to our zoning, a variance, getting cattle access to water. Now, those of you who are in rural areas know that for years, the environmental issue has been how do you keep cattle out of public waterways? And so over the years, Florida figured out that they would require farmers to fence all public waterways. They would build ponds for their animals. Well, if you're a cattle farmer, that was the last thing you wanted to have to do. And so they had fought forever. And the other four commissioners, you know, they had large cattle supporters. And so they hated the fact that they had to vote to restrict access to the water, but they ultimately had to do that. So she introduces an amendment saying, I have a cattle farmer who's having trouble with his ponds. He needs access to the river. I need a zoning variance for him to have access for his cattle. Well, the four of them, you know, jump on that one and say, that's a good one. We'll pass. So it went like that. Yes. The next day, as you can imagine, he started getting enormous kickback from all her environmental friends. Brenda, what in the hell are you doing? You know, we have been fighting for years to limit access to those rivers and streams. So she comes to Bubba and she said, I have made a huge mistake. And he said, yes, Brenda, you have made a huge mistake. And she said, what do I do about it? And he said, well, I suspect you're going to spend a lot of time explaining to all your friends how your immaturity about county government caught you in a huge bind. And she said, Bubba, that's a disaster for me. He said, well, let me suggest this. I voted in the majority. The next meeting, I will move that we reconsider that vote that went 5-0. And we'll talk with our colleagues about it. But he said, the first thing is that you have to commit to me and to them that the next time you have a great idea, you will share that with us, and we will talk about that before we put it in a public arena. And okay, I'll do that. So as he introduced his resolution to reconsider it. So she explained why this needed to be done. In the meantime, he took out a pocket knife and he reached over in front of her seat and carved a little notch in the table as a reminder to her that the next time she wanted to go against that culture, no one was going to save her. And so that culture worked in Polk County. Your culture works different, but I can guarantee you, you have a culture. So that's where we need to be spending some time in that culture and how you can adapt. Now, how does all that get to the world of communications? What you do these days as a county supervisor is important, not for how you do it, but what and what's the way you go about doing that work? And so I just want to say to you that if you are not exhibiting behaviors that reflect those 4 items of reason, respect, confidence, and stability, then you are causing turbulence. If you want to help alleviate turbulence in your community, you need to step back and say, what's my role here? How do I communicate with my behavior? My late wife was a mental health counselor, and there were many times when she would say, you're not listening to me. And I would say, yes, I heard everything you said. I listened, I got it. And she said, no, you listened, you didn't hear it. You listened, you didn't hear it. And so what we are in a situation with in our ability to communicate with our citizens these days is that, are they listening to what we say, or are they watching what we do? Now, I can guarantee you, and Larry would say this over and over and over, if you have a tremendous need to campaign, there's no better place than a board meeting, because you can set up your difference with everybody else almost on a weekly basis if you want to. If you are doing that, you may be helping your future election. You are destroying the capacity of the community to come together around some common themes. If you are not, as a board, focusing at early on in a term before everybody gets separated, if you're not focusing on where are we going to take this county over the next 2 to 4 years, then you're lost, because all you can do is react. And so if you are in that position, you have got to figure out a way with your team to step back. Now, that's hard to do, because in county government, nobody's in charge. 5 of you are going to decide among yourselves, or 6 or 7, or whatever the number is in your county. They vary from place to place. Nobody's in charge. Your manager, as professional as they are not in a position to instruct you on how to behave. Nor is your attorney. Your attorney can tell you what's legal and what's not legal, but not how to effectively interact. So I want to say, and I'm going to grab a mic because I want to have some conversation with some of you. There are mics. Dean, do we have mics around the table, or do I need to carry one? Okay. So what I want to do here for a few minutes is to ask some of you to give me an example of something that has worked or been a disaster in your community. And as I'm doing that, and I want you to focus in those 4 arenas: building stability, building confidence. And as I'm doing this, I want to say that county government is in a unique spot to deal with this very issue. From a stability and confidence standpoint, everything you do in your programs is measured. You have to measure and report to a state agency somewhere on every service that you provide. And so what that gives you is the opportunity to talk in substance about what this jurisdiction does, not ideas about what we do, or theories, or your own opinion about what they are. You can talk from substance. Now, if you want to find stability in any part of your life, you got to find it in things that are common to everybody, that everybody can understand. So I'm just, as a teacher, old teacher, it's hard to say, jump in, but give us an example, Kathy, something you think either fits or doesn't fit.
Oh, that's a hard one. So an example of where something worked or didn't
Either
work with the
or didn't,
community.
'cause we know that both exist.
So on our board, we were updating our zoning ordinance, and there were parts of the community that were concerned. And so trying to work through that, we were able to change our zoning ordinance. But it was difficult talking to people that had made their minds up without the details of what we were trying to do.
Do you feel like the board had the details that you needed?
I do think the board had the details.
Key point, if you don't think that you or your fellow board members have the substance that's necessary to deal with these issues, you need to get that. It's all available. And you've got staff that'll pull that out for you. Your turn.
All right. So something that does or does not work. So I represent a suburban area of a predominantly rural county. And so I would say that one of the things that we struggle with sometimes is to help our constituents in one area appreciate why something would be important to others. So let's take, for example, sidewalks. Some people will say, well, you don't need sidewalks because I don't need sidewalks. I live on a third of an acre. I might like to have sidewalks in my subdivision of everybody who has a quarter to a half of an acre, but people who live out in the rural aspects might not need that. And so they don't really understand what makes sense. And they'll say things like, you know, don't put a sidewalk in that new neighborhood because that's just a city thing. And those people won't need it. So I think those are the things that we have to do to go out and help people appreciate, no, this could be an amenity. You may not be able to care for your farm one day. You may need to move to a suburban neighborhood where your grandchildren may wish to come over and ride their bikes along said sidewalk. And so when you can humanize it and help articulate it that way, sometimes that is better.
When I was listening to the governor earlier, he was talking about how phenomenal Virginia is, and I would certainly concur in everything he said about the place we live. It occurred to me that you as county officials are putting a big chunk of money into economic development teams to help spread that word around the country about your county, and in fact, around the world. And I was listening to that and thinking, I wonder how many counties are hiring professionals to tell that story to their citizens, because your citizens don't know that. Your citizens see and hear something entirely different.
Okay.
Working with a whole board, Eric. Come on.
Well, I guess a prime example, we're going through redistricting right now and determining how we want to move forward with that. So, you know, certainly from different board members, they have different perspectives on, you know, how we want to move forward with that. Do we want to stay with a current 5 district? Do we want to go to a greater district? So there's, you know, a lot of communication and representation for their constituents. So it's really just kind of finding that common ground of the board.
Good, and that's tough to find because everybody has a different opinion about that. But you're working from data, and so it's like, oh, I want that chunk. It has to fit into a larger picture. Anybody here on a board that has a recalcitrant board member? I was, you know, somebody just doesn't know. Yes, I think. Yeah, well, not anymore. Hey, did you do it or did the citizen do that? That's an interesting question. Do any of you, the question was, do any of you sit on a board where you have what I call a recalcitrant supervisor? Some would call it just a plain troublemaker. Okay.
Just a quick example, we were at a retreat and one of our board members in small groups, we were writing down the difference between campaigning and governing, which is, there's a big difference, everyone would, and this person wasn't writing anything down because they said there was no difference.
There's an educational opportunity. You know, years ago, I was at a management training seminar led by one of McKinsey's world-class trainers. And every time somebody in a group would talk about a problem, he would interrupt and say, no, it's not a problem, it's an opportunity. And then that went on forever, you know, the whole morning it was going on. And finally, he put the mic in front of a person and said, it's not a problem, it's an opportunity. And this woman said, you know, some opportunities are insurmountable. And so you never quite can know about that. But there are ways to deal with that. I was asked a number of years ago, I'm not going to name this jurisdiction, but it's a Virginia jurisdiction. I was asked to come because they had a new member of their board who just used every example every meeting as an opportunity to campaign. Didn't matter what was going on, he was going to make campaign speech. And they were televised. And so I was asked, and it was becoming very dysfunctional, as you might guess. So I was asked, would I come down and spend some time with that board? And one of the things we did, and if you've got a recalcitrant board member, you might think about doing this. We had the board gave them 3x5 cards. We asked them to measure a whole set of criteria about the board's behavior. How were they perceived by the community? They were on television. How did they perceive their fellow board members as an individual? How did they perceive themselves in that group? Everything done on a scale of 1 to 5. Now, it didn't surprise me at all that none of those issues got rated higher than a 3. So everybody saw all the issues as a disaster, including their own behavior. So then we started this conversation about you may not be able to correct the behavior of one, but you can correct the behavior of the rest of you. And then you can figure out what are you going to do to isolate the one, to either bring them on to the board or simply say they're an outcast. And the public needs to understand that, not from a political standpoint, but simply they were here, they were elected to come here with us to help do something, and we're doing it, and they're staying on the sidelines. Do the citizens in that district want to be represented that way? The board's not making that decision. The citizens made that decision. And after about 4 months, that person began to hear from his own citizens saying, why are you not representing us in these conversations? And he finally came back to the chair of the board at that time and said, you know, we need to rethink about how this is happening. And so, Dean, it looks like I'm getting near the end of my time. If you got more, I'll take it. But we're done? Okay. Business meeting time. But thank you all very much for being with us. And those of you who are willing to say something, I appreciate it.